Hi, this video will walk you through the steps to building a Romeo and Juliet Birdhouse kit made by American Original Dollhouse. If you're watching this video, it's probably because you've already purchased a Birdhouse kit. If not, you can follow the link above and find out more information on how to order yours. There's a few things that you're going to need before we get started. A Phillips screwdriver, or if you have a drill driver available, some 1-inch or 2-inch masking tape. The 1-inch is a little easier to use, and also a damp rag to wipe off excess glue. Alright, let's get started. Okay, you're going to find everything you need in the box. You want to just verify that everything is there. All the parts are lettered, so you're going to have two sides, a front and a back. Two roof sections. And the base, which has a upside and a bottom, and it's important to know that for later on. The bottom has the countersunk holes, and that's where the screws will recess. You're also going to have 100 grit sandpaper, the instructions, which on the back side will list all the parts. You're going to have several trim pieces that will be batched together, and then a small parts bag which will contain the flourish, the bird hole, screws, and the glue. Okay, the first part we're going to start with is the front and the back. You can move everything else out of the way. You're going to need the glue bottle, and then also panel A and panel B, or part A and part B. And the front and back trim is part F. There are two sets that look similar. There's the front and the back trim, and also the roof. The shorter ones are for the front and the back. The longer ones, of course, are for the roof. And that is part F for the front and back, and part J for the roof. And there's just one sticker on. You can check for the best face, although both should be equally good. You can also sand the edges lightly beforehand just to remove any slivers or any rough edges. It's not necessary though, you can do that at the end. Now you want to make sure you apply glue to the right side. So if you line them up together back to back, or the long side to the long side, you'll know which is, you'll only glue one side that way. And it doesn't take much glue, it's an extremely strong adhesive. So just a small bead of glue. Make sure that the side and the bottom are flush. The top is not as important, but the sides and the bottom must be flush. There should be absolutely no overhang. You can use another piece of trim to line it up to make sure that it's flush to the edge. And if there's any glue at this point that has seeped out, make sure that you wipe it with a wet rag. It's easier to clean off the excess glue now than it is to wait until after it dries. And just a friction fit is all it's going to take. Just push down gently and make sure it's firm contact. And then we can set that aside. Now repeat with the back section. And again, make sure that you're gluing the right side of the trim piece. And line it up nicely with the flush with the sides and flush with the bottom. And again, double check to make sure you're putting glue to the right side. And just a small bead of glue. I may say that a lot. Okay, with that in place, we can set these two parts aside and we'll let them dry while we're working on the base. We'll apply 10 pieces of masking tape, 3 on each side and 2 on the bottom, with approximately 4 inches, with 1 inch on the piece itself and 3 inches hanging over the edge. 2 to 3. And this will assist us in holding the trim pieces in place while the glue sets. And now just flip it over and taking care not to allow the tape to fold underneath. And then start with the 2 shorter sides. And that would be the, let's see, the trim. The short side is part H. And you want to make sure that it aligns to the 2 sides. Now it's going to overhang the bottom just slightly. Just pull the tape tight and make sure that the piece stays straight. And then we'll do the other short side here. And just push it firm with the table surface that you're working on so that the top lines up nice and smoothly. And again, the bottom is a drip edge, so it will hang over just slightly. And as long as you're applying the right amount of glue, just that little bead, you shouldn't have any seepage. But if you do, it's a good time now to wipe it before it does set up. And now we'll do the long sides. Again, just making sure that the edges line up evenly and it's pushed tight to the table, the surface that you're working on. And pull the tape tight. You don't have to apply too much pressure on the tape, just make sure that it's firmly in place and then push it down nice and firm. And repeat with the other side. And just make sure that the tape is firmly in place. And we can put this one aside. You want the glued pieces to sit for about 15 minutes or so before you work on them again. While those are drying, we're going to work on the balcony. So we're going to grab the thicker long piece and the 2 shorter thick pieces. Now the flourish is somewhat fragile before it is glued on, just because it's cut out on a CNC machine, so the grain of the wood runs in one direction. So just handle it carefully until it's glued into place. Now take the longer front balcony piece and the shorter 2 sides. Now you want to apply a little more glue to the short side, generally just because it's end grain wood and it does suck in a little more of the glue. And now carefully just push it on top of the long piece. And I like to start on the inside at an angle and lean it in to push the glue out to the outside of the balcony, so the glue seepage is on the outside, which is much easier to wipe. And we'll repeat with the other side. Again, just a little extra glue on the end grain. Again, just line it up with the outside of the balcony, the long piece. Angle it and push it out, and wipe excess glue. And now we're going to work on the sides. We're going to do the same thing that we did with the base. We're going to put a couple of pieces of tape on it. Make sure we're putting the tape on the shorter side, which is the outside of the birdhouse. So the long side should be on your table, and apply about 4 pieces of masking tape, 2 to each side. And we'll run a bead of glue down one side of the back of the birdhouse. Now this is on the inside of the birdhouse, so the trim is laying on the table flat. We'll stand it up, makes it a little bit easier. And just carefully push the two together, lining them up, making sure that they are flush to the outside. And just fold the tape over to hold it in place. You'll have a few seconds, or a few minutes, I'm sorry, after you glue it up to make any adjustments. So as long as you're doing everything in one step without stopping and letting the glue dry, you'll have time to fix it. Again, with the front, make sure that the front trim pieces are facing out, and apply another bead of glue. And we'll attach that side. I'm just double checking here to make sure that everything is lined up, and wrap the tape. And now when we put the other side on, you're going to have to separate the front and the back just slightly so you can get it in there without squeezing the glue out or without wiping the glue off on the front and back. Just carefully, it doesn't have to be that wide, just enough that you can get it in there without removing the glue. Line it up again and wrap the tape. And when you're done with that, just take a look at it and make sure everything is tight, flush, and that there's no glue seepage that you need to wipe off. And that's the main part of the birdhouse. And we'll put that aside for now, let that set up. And then we'll work on G once it sets up. That'll be the trim that goes on both sides. Alright, we've fast forwarded and the body has had time to dry or set up so we can remove the tape. I actually left it for about a half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour, to let it set up completely so it's easier to work with. And you can remove the stickers at this time also. Now the trim pieces for the side are part G. And again, there's a long side and a short side. So make sure that the long side, it'll follow the angle of the roof. The long side goes on the inside. So you apply the glue to the long side of part G. And we'll put the roof together first before we do that. That's part D. You want to lay it so the long edge is facing you or facing up and together. So line the two together so that the two long edges are lined up. Making sure that they're flush. You want them absolutely perfectly flush at this point. And then we'll run a bead of tape. I'm sorry, not a bead of tape. We'll run a tape along the seam to hold that in place. And just make sure that it's firmly in place. And flip the roof section over. And now we're going to apply glue to the inside of the roof, the middle of the arch, the middle of the roof. Now you want a consistent bead on this because that's going to keep the birdhouse waterproof, keep the roof waterproof. Also along the edges of the house. And on all edges. Make sure you have a good bead running all the way because this is really going to help support the entire birdhouse. And using the masking tape on the roof makes it much easier to glue it together. You just fold it in half. And the masking tape is going to hold it. It's going to hold that joint nice and tight. Just flip it over and place it on top of the house. Now you want to make sure that about 2 inches hangs over the front of the birdhouse and 1 inch over the back. So a majority of it's going to hang over the bird hole opening. It doesn't have to be exactly 2 inches. You know, your preference is just fine. But most of it should hang over the front. And again, you can use masking tape to hold the roof in place, like I will eventually to continue working. That'll make things much easier. As you flip it over to check for glue seepage, just hold the roof in place. So I'm setting it on one side of the roof and then holding the other roof with my hand. Once it sets there, it is at 45 degrees, so it will stand up on its own. I'm just wiping off a little excess glue. As long as you don't let that glue dry when you put the trim on, if you put the trim on while it's still wet, it will be just fine. Just make sure that you put the trim on before the glue dries up, sets up. At this point, you can set it aside and let it set up. However, I'm just going to keep going, and we'll put the 4-part G's on, which are the 4 side trim. And again, there's just one sticker for all 4. And that's going to cover up the edge on the front, the back, on both sides. And again, make sure it's flush with the front and the back and the bottom. The top isn't as important. It's not going to be seen. But you do want to make sure that it is snug to the base when the base goes on later on. So again, we'll apply a small bead of glue on each of the trim pieces. And again, on the long side of the trim piece. So it follows the roof angle. The top will follow the roof angle. So just look for that 45-degree miter end on the trim. And now before you move on, just make sure that there's no glue seepage and wipe that right away. It'll save you a lot of time at the end. And we're lining up again the bottom and the side. Or I'm sorry, the front. Now I'm going to use tape to hold everything in place temporarily. I'm going to put a piece on the roof and wrap it around the bottom. That'll hold that in place. And then a couple of pieces on the trim on the top and on the bottom. As you're taping it, just be careful that the trim piece doesn't move And if it does, just make sure that you fix it before moving on, before you let the glue set up. And we'll do 2 more on the front. And wipe any glue seepage. And make sure you pull it tight enough, the tape tight enough that the piece sets nice and flat. Remove any stickers. And we'll work on the other side. Again, I'm going to use some tape to hold the roof in place. And it doesn't take much, just 1 piece. We'll get the other 2 part G's. And again, make sure the long side, I don't know if you can see this, but the tall side again goes to the house. And apply glue to both. And we'll put that in place and line it up again with the front and flush with the bottom. Again, we'll use 2 pieces of tape on the front and 2 pieces of tape on the back to hold that in place. Now we can stand the birdhouse up and make sure that everything is nice and tight, that nothing moved on us. And now we can work on part J, which is the roof trim, and there'll be 4 of those banded together with 1 label. Just peel the roof tape back a little bit, enough that you can see the seam. And you're going to want to line it up so it matches the wood. And it's going to hang over the bottom and also at the edge of the roof. So it's slightly longer than the roof edge. The most important thing is that the 2 tops meet perfectly flush and that they're even with the top of the roof. So the top of the roof should be nice and flat. I like to put the 2 small sides together or 2 large sides together so I know I'm gluing the right side of each one. And you want the glue to be slightly closer to the longer side, the top, than the bottom. And just a thin bead of glue. There's plenty of glue, but you don't want to overuse the glue because it is much more difficult to clean it up afterward. Again, just line it up with the roof peak. And we'll run a piece of tape to hold that in place temporarily. And it doesn't hurt to wrap it around the piece completely to make sure it doesn't lift up on the piece. Make sure these 2 are nice and snug and that everything is flush. And again, 2 pieces of tape, hold it in place. And wrap it around like I said. All right, we'll pull the tape on the back side of the roof and repeat with the back. And so you can see what I'm doing here. I got the two short sides together. Just to make sure I glue the right side. Line the center up again and make sure it's flush with the top. Again, with the other side, we'll line up the peak, make sure that the top again is nice and tight, there's no gaps, and make sure that it's flush with the top of the roof. And now you can set the entire thing aside for about 15-20 minutes, half an hour if you prefer. I'm going to keep working just so I can keep going here, but as long as everything's taped thoroughly and you're moving it slow, you should be just fine. I'm just being careful not to move any of the pieces out of place. And just fix any gaps that you find at this point before the glue does set. All right, looks good. Now we'll glue the bird hole onto the front. That's the arched opening. Now it does have a front and a back. It's a little hard to tell, but the front is slightly softened on the inside and on the outside. You'll see just a slight indent. So you want that part facing out. And then just use the pre-drilled hole to line this part up. Keep the glue on the inside away from the edges and away from the hole so you're not having seepage in the wrong places. Just center that, push that in place, and try and line it up as best you can with the bottom. It'll be easier when we put the shutters on to see that it's straight. So you want to put the shutters on as soon as you finish putting the bird hole opening on so you can line it up. It's much easier to line everything up with the shutters installed. So we'll grab the shutters. There's two shutters. There's a wider end on the bottom that goes on the bottom and a narrower one that goes on the top, so make sure that those are both in the same direction. And I don't think you can see it real clearly here, but the larger one will be on the bottom. You can see it when they line up next to each other, that they're definitely a wider end. And just make sure that they line up flush with the bottom of the bird hole opening. We'll flip those over and apply glue to both. And now before it sets, before the glue sets, just eyeball the alignment of the shutters and the bird hole opening. it's pretty easy to get it pretty close. Okay, now we can put the balcony on the front. We'll get the tape out of the way. If you've let it sit and let the tape set, then it's going to be much easier to install the small accessories afterward. But I'm going to keep, I kept working, so apply a little extra glue to the balcony pieces. There's not much surface holding the balcony on, so in this case you do want to use a little extra glue. And just make sure it's centered and flush to the bottom of the shutters. And you can just hold it in place for a couple of seconds. This piece is a little difficult to run tape on, so if you get any glue squeeze out, which is alright on this piece, just take a damp rag and wipe that. Now I'm going to set this aside and let it dry thoroughly before I put the flourish on, just because it's more difficult to work with everything trying to put the flourish on. So now that everything's set up, I've let it sit for about 15 minutes. Actually, I let it sit about a half an hour, so we'll remove the tape completely now at this point. Okay, now it's not a bad time to take the 100 grit sandpaper and just soften some of the edges up. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time on that, depending on what you want to do. It's up to your preference, but generally I just knock off the sharp edges, the roof edge and the front and back edges. And when the roof is done right, you'll see that the seam is really tight. And now we can remove the tape from the base also, so we can install that. Okay, now we can install the flourish, but I'd prefer to install the base first. So you find your 4 screws that came in the small parts bag, and we're going to insert the screws. I'm going to use my drill driver just to make it a little faster, but just your Phillips is just fine. Now you want to install them about a 1/16 or a little more than a 1/16 of an inch over the top of the base. This will just help you to line them up with the base. You can push the base into it. You can see it's just sticking up just a little bit there. We'll do all 4 of them like that. That way when you set the base down, you can set the house right on top of it, get it lined up nicely, and it will hold it in place while you flip it over to insert the screws fully. And now that you have all 4 of them sticking up just a little bit, now again, the same way the roof went on, most of the base is going to be on the front side. And again, just use your judgment on this, but just line it up. Make sure you're centered left to right on the base. And once you get it centered front and back, I'm sorry, centered left and right, you can kind of get the front and back also. Then you just want to push it down so it sets into the screws a little bit. And then you can flip it upside down, or flip it onto one side of the roof. And then you can just screw the screws all the way in. And also, it's important not to use glue on the base. You do want to be able to remove the base to clean it out. If you do actually use it as a birdhouse, you want to be able to clean it out at the end of the year. So if you put glue on it, you're not going to be able to take the base off, and you're not going to be able to clean it out. If you're just using it for a garden decoration or a house decoration, you can just glue the bottom end. You don't need to use the screws. That's up to your preference, though. And now we just have the flourish to put on. Now the flourish can be placed anywhere underneath the front. I like it closer to the front. It adds a little more dimension or depth to it. But wherever your preference is, you can place it wherever you'd like. Again, remember that the flourish is slightly fragile before it's glued into place. Once it's glued in, there's nothing to worry about. It's just while it's not glued in, it's a little fragile. So make sure you apply plenty of glue to the flourish. And I just use my finger to run alongside of the edge of the flourish to keep the glue bottles centered. And just carefully place it where you like. And try and keep it even, the right amount of space left and right from the front, or equidistant from front and back. Now you can hold it in place for a couple of minutes and let it set up, or you can put tape on, because odds are it's not going to fit completely snug right away without taping it in place. But if you hold it for a few minutes, the glue will set up a little bit and allow you, it will make it just a little easier to put the tape on, hold it in place. While this is setting up, I just want to thank you. Because of the noise in the shop, unfortunately, we had to I had to do the recording afterward, so I appreciate you bearing with me. Unfortunately, the sound wasn't picked up, and it's just too loud in our shop. So just apply some glue in the top in the bottom of the flourish. Should be enough to hold it. And just make sure it's tight to the birdhouse. And now you can just set it aside. We're done. Okay, the glue is set. I removed the tape and did a final sanding. Most hobby and craft stores carry inexpensive acrylic paints.
Like I used on mine.
Afterward, you want to apply a couple of coats of an exterior polyurethane to all surfaces, including the inside. I hope this video has helped, and if you have any questions, our email will be posted below. Otherwise, you can ask questions in the comment section. Thank you very much, and enjoy your birdhouse.